Miranda's first webcomic, Into the Swell, is nearing the end of its piratey tale. That means it's the perfect time to catch up before the magical finale releases on June 3rd. Join Kelwyn and Fletcher as their ocean adventure comes to a close and all their secrets are laid bare. Don't want to wait to see the end? Not to worry. You can access the complete Into the Swell story in paperback form on Amazon.com or in PDF form on Miranda's Ko-fi shop. Both are available now. Check out mirandacakes.art for links to read or purchase. And thank you for joining her crew on their webcomic adventure.
Just do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday said tomorrow. So just do it! Make your dreams come true!
And welcome to Screen Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today we're going to be talking about one of the stages many creators go through while in the early stages of planning their comic. That is, the planning itself, also known as drafting the first outline. I'm Crispy, my pronouns are she, they, and I make the comic Ghost Junk Sickness.
And I'm Delphina, my pronouns are she, her, and I make the comic Zombulus.
And I'm Rennie, I use she, they pronouns, and I make the webcomic Kate Blast.
And I am Verathane. I use she, they pronouns, and I make the webcomics Chiralt and Witchwood.
So, you've got a cool idea for a comic. You have some characters, maybe some fun designs, maybe some great world building, and a few cool ideas for scenes that you can't wait to share with potential readers. But how do you put it all together? What does that process look like? This stage is an amorphous blob that fits whatever shape is needed by the creator and can look like many different things, so we're here to talk about it.
So I guess our first question that we want to get into is, do you guys outline your comic, and what does that look like for you guys?
I actually spend quite a lot of time outlining because I don't know, I guess on some level I enjoy planning, I suppose. I've tried it in a few different ways just because I really like to get kind of a picture of where I'm headed and what I'm doing. Usually I'll have kind of a vague idea. Like at the very beginning, I'm like, I want to make a story and I have characters, and I'll just kind of be turning it all over in my head as I think about these things. And at some point I have to kind of sit down and start making sense of everything and figuring out the order in which all of my various loose plot ideas have to happen in. And I've tried it in various different ways. I tend to like doing as much of my planning as possible on paper, just because something about like the tactile feedback of writing with a pencil on a sheet of paper is like, it helps to solidify it in my mind somehow. This does mean that like erasing and moving things around is kind of annoying. So sometimes I'll just go through an awful lot of paper, like making different drafts this way. I'll be like, I don't think I like this order. I need to make a new one. A lot of my planning for Chiralt was done that way. I would just like write things down in tiny little notebooks, a little bit at a time, and then gradually add things to a bigger document that I could keep track of things in later. For Witchwood, I switched my process to be digital, both for the planning and for the actual art. And initially what I tried doing was using Trello to outline. And Trello is like this, it's like I'm not actually sure what to even call it, but you kind of write little notes down and they almost look like little Post-it notes that you can organize into columns. And I kind of wanted to play with it because it gives you the ability to write these little Post-it note things and then move them around and put them in different orders. So when I was in the very earliest stages of planning Witchwood, I kind of had this, I just wrote down all the cool scene ideas that I had in these little note cards. And then I was like, all right, so where should I actually start the story? What's the first scene? And then I started moving things around until I kind of had a picture of the whole story. And then the next thing that I wanted to do after that was I wanted to be able to share this with like beta readers and friends to get some feedback on it, because I wanted to get input on this whole process kind of as early as possible. So I transcribed I'm doing big air quotes here, but my final Trello outline into a big Google document that I sent to a couple of friends that I kind of trusted. And I was like, what's your take on this? Does this seem like a solid story? And it was nice doing that, even though I have now thrown out almost like half of what was in that outline, if not more, just to kind of give myself a picture of like, here's a version of the story that could be. And even when I make big changes, my old outlines kind of become like AU versions of it. I'm just kind of figuring out what I want to do a little better every time. So even though nothing's final, I still love the process of outlining, just to kind of get my thoughts in a line and have an idea of where I'm headed with all this.
I like that point that you made where it's just like it gets better with every time that you kind of have at it and whatnot. And the fact that outlines aren't permanent either. They're kind of like stepping stones. And like we were talking about, like outline as the word is kind of like this umbrella kind of thing to me anyway in my process that includes a lot of several little steps to make the comic at this final point that it can get to be. How I outlined Ghost Junk has changed tremendously in the years that we've made it, because I mean, I've been working on Ghost Junk for 8 years this year, and I work with my co-creator. So a lot of my ideas have to be like very, very solid and very clear so that she understands the point that I'm getting across too. And so that the ideas, are so much more understandable for each other. So when we started, like Thane, I do like having that kind of like tangible version of it. I have several notebooks. We had like a spiral that we had specifically for it. And we would do different types of outlining. So I would have this book that planned out my characters' timelines, their arcs, their personalities, right down to their gestures that they make. And then we'd kind of, go from there, kind of pull from that. And then my other book that I would have is dedicated just to solid plot outlining. So there's the plot timeline, where we'd have the events that would start to correlate with the characters' timelines, events, and stuff like that. So when I explain it like this, it also sounds very intimidating because it sounds like a lot of information, to people who still don't know my OCs or my comic and stuff like that. So it's different for everyone. And again, like I was saying, the process has very much changed from that. We are actually starting another comic soon, and we're going right to Google Docs with this stuff, as well as still having our tangible notebooks that we kind of start from. And then you refine in Google Docs, and then you refine, more as the time goes on. And I think that that's like the biggest part about the stage, is that it's always about refining that idea in your brain so that it makes the most sense when it comes to drawing it and then making it a comic and stuff like that. So the process for planning, I think, is very, very long. And it's something that I don't think a lot of people consider as big of a part as it should be. And, not saying that, like, calling people out or anything like that when I say stuff like that, but planning itself takes months upon months to do. So when I say stuff like that, I want to say it in a way that it's like, don't feel bad that you're not fast enough doing it. Because I think that with the planning process, you also have to catch yourself on good writing days too, because webcomics take like all those different kind of hats to make, right? So when you have all these things to kind of consider, and the things that you have to kind of put in order and plan and do all that stuff, doing that together is what's going to make the story, and doing it for you is going to make it easier to translate.
The idea of being like fast enough with the outline is it's a bit of a funny one to me, because I feel like the outlining, it doesn't stop when you start drawing the pages.
Yes.
Like for me, it's just a process that keeps happening the whole time. I'm constantly going back in and cutting things, and I'll have a daydream and I'll write the daydream down and find a way to work it into the story.
Exactly. Like you were talking about like using so much paper when you were doing planning, and we did the same thing. And I also consider thumbnailing a huge part of my planning / outlining stage, because we're still trying to figure out the flow and stuff like that of the story. So when we get to that part, it's really, really funny because we thumb everything traditionally, and we have these, printer papers. I think sometimes we manage to get 12 thumbs on a page. I don't know how. We don't do that anymore. I think it's 9 now. No, I think it's 6. It's 6. But what we would do is, we'd reread the work before we go into a chapter, right? Because we plan far enough ahead so that we can plot foreshadowing and all these little hints that we want to do. And, have that little mystery kind of reveal itself if you want to reread it again. But anyway, so we'd reread the outline and then we'd be like, well, crap, that sucks. And we'd take the scissors and like cut out the outline little square and we'd have it taped somewhere else. And then it would be like stapled somewhere else like this. And it would just look like an absolute hot mess. Like, and to the point where it's like, okay, like we always do that before we're going to start another chapter. We go and reread the thumbs, we reread the outline, and we're like, okay, we're in the zone. And then you start to realize that, maybe things don't make sense with the way that you think now. So of course it's going to change. And then, by the time I've like Frankenstein this poor thumbnail page, it's just like, okay, now we have to start from scratch and basically, quote unquote, rewrite it. And I say it like that because it's not being rewritten as if it didn't exist. It's just being refined. I should probably say that. But yeah, it's a time. And I will say that when I'm in this part of my comic, because we do keep going back to it every time we start another chapter, me and my co-creator kind of do like these little meetings and we get into the headspace, and it probably takes 2 weeks to about a month, and I'm really glad that we have a buffer to do that, for us to like hammer everything out. No drawing happens in that time unless we're just working away at a buffer or a different stage of the comic, and then it's just easier to kind of tackle as a whole, because there's a lot of steps to making this happen. And I think that if anything, that really helps people appreciate the amount of work that it takes to make webcomics, because it's easily the size of a small studio to create what we do as teams of 2 or even just one person.
I think that's so interesting too, when you say refining versus rewriting. That really sticks with me, because I always felt like I was wasting my time with outlines because I would have to rewrite them. But when you think of art, when you think of the drawing process, you always make a sketch first. You always have that place where you kind of practice and play and see what works and see what doesn't, and kind of come up with your ideas that way. And it might change in the final drawing. It might change when you ink or pencil or anything like that. Why is writing any different than that? Like you can totally do a sketch, and that's kind of how I think of the outlining process, as the sketch version only written.
That's so true.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think what trips me up about the word outline is that I always think of what I was taught in English classes in school. Like you start writing with a Roman numeral I, and you give it subsections depending on how broad or specific the section is, and everything you write should perfectly encapsulate it because you're going to get graded by your teacher. And that is not the case when you are...
What, you mean you don't have a teacher?
Where's my webcomics teacher? Oh my God, she never showed up. God.
I know. A substitute.
Oh gosh, well that explains a lot for me. But I think for me, the key is to keep my outlines quick, keep them loose. I really like the card idea that Thane was talking about. That's something I definitely did at first too. I would get loose sketches on quarter sheets of paper. I would just take printer paper that I had from work that was going to get thrown away anyway. I would cut each piece into 4 sections, and I would draw my things on the back. And this is like thumbnailing, except I didn't really have a script yet. So this is also where scripting would happen. And I would just draw out ideas. I would say, like, what if this happened? Let me do like the quickest, loosest 3-minute sketch of what a page like this would look like. And having that visual for me really made a difference over just a page of text that looked like a to-do list for me. And I could rearrange the order. I could throw it away if it totally wasn't working and I hadn't spent a lot of time on it. And for me, that was a little easier, because when I looked at a page or a Google document that had lots of text, my eyes would just glaze over. And another thing I did last chapter that I don't know if it always works, but it was kind of fun to do when I was trying to figure out a theme, was a bingo card approach. I just basically went on a bingo card maker website, and it gave me 24 little boxes to write in. And because it's a bingo size box, right, it's not very big. So you only have like as much space as like you can legibly read. So it forced me to keep all of my concepts very short, very succinct, and it wasn't in a list. And that's kind of the idea of bingo. You're going to get some squares, you're not going to get others. And that's okay. That's like, for me, I don't know what it was psychologically about seeing my plot points on a bingo grid as opposed to a list. But all of a sudden, I felt like I don't have to do any of these that don't make sense. If that number, if we don't call I4, then it's no skin off my back. That doesn't mean I lost bingo. I still have other options on the card. So that was a way to kind of bring a little more play into it, bring a little more experimentation into it, see what things connected and see what things worked. And so, yeah, it's a little nonlinear. It's a little more like fun, but that's kind of how I'm learning my brain works. I need a little fun and I need a little play, and I need to be able to just tell myself that if I don't get to everything on this list, or if I have to refine this and change it, that's okay.
Side note, but I had no idea that you could just go to a website that would generate the bingo sheet for you.
Oh yeah.
I've been saving other people's and clearing them in Photoshop and then typing things out meticulously myself like a plebe.
Oh,
I've been
no,
doing
no,
the same
no.
thing.
Same. Gosh.
I mean, there's a website that would just do it for me.
Yep.
Nobody told me this.
It's
Oh,
beautiful.
modern times.
And these are the things that you can learn from people's processes.
Gosh. Yeah, I definitely resonate with the whole non-linear approach too, because like the way that I definitely have a little bit of a different outlining process, because like I sort of approach it from every story that I've written or have started writing has always started with the end first. I go in with an idea for like, I want this. I want the story to end like this. How do we get there? And then then from there it's like, okay, we have the end, now we need the beginning. And then I sort of go from there in like this weird back and forth like tennis match almost of like, okay, we got until we get more and stuff is sort of filled into the middle. So it'll be like, okay, we end here, but in order to get there, we need to start here. Okay, we have these people. In order to trigger the end events, they have to do this. And then it's sort of back and forth, and it sort of helps me sort of process things, because if I've sat down and just went, okay, chapter 1, page 1, head empty, can't do it. Just doesn't work that way for me. So I need little goalposts to sort of break it up into smaller, more manageable pieces for me. How that looks tangibly is I have ADHD, so I have 5 different notebooks that are not organized by character or plot outline. They're just notebooks that are filled with everything. That's how it is. But my Google Docs is sort of where everything starts coming together, where I have like sort of folders upon folders layered into each other of like, okay, this is the overall framework, which is what I start with. And then from there, I go with book outline. And then from there, it's chapter outline. And I have sort of that iterative approach, because just the way that my brain processes it is I need those bite-sized pieces. So it takes a lot of work, but it also helps me get thinking about, okay, how am I going to hit these points or these ideas or themes in a general like 30,000 foot view? Because that's to me what outlining is. It's the 30,000 foot view.
Visiting your point about having 5 different sketchbooks or notebooks filled with your ideas and stuff like that, and being like, it's in there somewhere. When we started Ghost Junk Sickness, it was all in our sketchbooks, and it was my sketchbooks and it was my co-creator's sketchbooks, and between us there was 10 sketchbooks plus.
Oh no.
And it would be like, oh yeah, it was that plot point in which sketchbook? I think it was your sketchbook, or maybe it was my sketchbook.
Oh no. Yep. That is me, where it's just like, I'm like, okay, well, I know I wrote down how old Kate is. All right, which notebook is it in?
Yep.
Okay, nope. Is it in the binder? No, it's not in the binder. Okay, is it in this one? Is it in the cool hardbound one, or is it in the weird stapled one together that looks like a kindergartner made it?
Oh yeah. And yeah, I tried to like distinguish like the sketchbooks I had and the ones that she had, but for some reason the way that I distinguished these books was painting Samus from Metroid on them, but they're all just Samus. I'm like, oh, so it's a Samus one. I don't know which Samus, but
That doesn't really layer it down. But that's sort of like I started in like sort of chapter 3. I started buying chapter specific, like of those like college ruled notebooks that cost like $2 at the pharmacy, sort of buying those. So anything chapter 4 related is in the purple notebook. That's it. And it's got chapter 4 written on top in Sharp because it costs $2. And it's just crappy paper so that like I like doing my outline stage. Like if it's not like the Google Docs final asterisk version that goes out to beta readers, it's always on the crappiest paper that I can buy, and it's in pen because I always find like it's like a lot easier for me to just go and not feel like I have to hold back, because like if I use a nice notebook or nice paper, I always feel like, okay, well, I have to do this paper justice, so I take my time and like, maybe I shouldn't write this down. Where if it's the crappy paper, you can just get all your ideas dumped out of your head, and then you can see them all and go, okay, this one works, pick it out, this one doesn't work, toss it. And it's just so that sort of helps, sort of the way that I think of sort of just getting it all, get that info dump out of your brain.
Yeah, figuring out how to pick and choose like what to keep is definitely a big part of the outlining process, which leads into the second question of this episode, which is how do you decide when a scene needs to be cut or added or moved around? Like, just kind of walk us through the logic process. Rennie?
Yeah. So one of the things that I do is I go in with a list of 3 questions that I got to ask myself after I've sort of done that info dump stage is okay, does this scene or point advance the plot? Does this scene or point relate to the relevant themes in other scenes or chapters that are nearby it? And 3, is this scene or point going to be fun for me to create and for the reader to actually read? Sometimes you don't get a scene that's fun to draw because like every cartoon and comic has a thing that's like, gosh, this is going to be such a pain to draw. Like I got to draw a crowd scene with like 400 ghosts. Like, no, that's not probably not going to be the most fun to draw.
And
But
then they ride away on 6 bicycles.
no, the bicycles are on top of elephants riding cars. But it's like, so it's not always going to be fun to draw, but the main point is it going to be fun for the reader? So it's like it's always got to have like some sort of element of each of those 3 questions. And if it's not really that relevant, I cut it out. And usually when I say cut it out, I just put it into a separate Google Doc that's like, this is cut content, because what cut content is good for? Bonus content. Always save cut stuff for bonus stuff, because then future you will thank you for saving something for them to draw. But it's always got to relate to, is it relevant? Does it move things forward? And would it be fun?
It's just something that I think about a lot. And one of the things that I always encourage webcomicers to do is that save yourself some time to reread the work that you've published and created so that you can understand the direction and be like, okay, I'm checking back on this. Is this the theme? Is this the direction that I wanted to go? Does this make sense? Are people having a good time? Am I having a good time? And, that really helps, like, you kind of solidify that relationship that you have with your work, because like we always say, webcomics are very transformative. They do change over time with the writing style, with the way that it's presented, because you're changing and because webcomics take so long to make. So scene cuts have definitely happened in my work, and scene changes have happened quite frequently too. Like I said previously, we do a lot of rereading of the outlines. I save time to reread the comic. I probably do it about twice a year, because we have a lot of pages. So there's, to sit there and be like, okay, you're kind of in editing mode a little bit, and then, you're also trying to see how it goes. But yeah, it does take a lot of time. One disclaimer I will say, so that you will get out of the kind of quote unquote reboot hell, because this is something that people face a lot, is that give your comic 2 years of being published online before you start going in and changing things as it's going. I've changed things in Ghost Junk because we've been doing it for almost 8 years, and it's just refining the process so that I'm just like, oh, okay, I'm going to change some of the bubbles. I'm going to recolor or actually color the first 32 pages as a treat. etc., etc., give yourself 2 years at least, because if you start diving in too early, you're going to obsessively change way too much. It's never going to get done. But with that, we have changed things when we've started rereading the outline based on reader feedback. I've said this in a previous episode, but we were going to kill a character off, and we were right there about to do it. It was the chapter of her death, and I was reading some of the reactions that people were having, and it just made me sit there being like, it doesn't make sense that we're going to axe this character that is such a, big part of the comics aesthetic, a big part of why people read it, or, this people really, really like this character. And I think that we're good enough writers to still have the impact of what a death would be like, and have that plot move forward in the way that we wanted it to move if she were to die. And so when that happened, like I said, it was the chapter right before we were going to start drawing. We had to do this major rehaul of, rewriting basically the whole story at that point, because now she's in it. So saving yourself some time to do that is really, really good, because that did actually take a month to reread and rewrite and refinish everything, so that the smooth transition was there, the impact was still there, and things made sense for the readers and for us to actually enjoy it. So that's just really important, to just give yourself that time so that you can kind of reflect on a lot of the things that you've put up.
And I think that the key thing that you said there is like giving yourself the ability to go back and check on things later and go, did this thing that we're about to do, or this thing that we did, does this still line up with the overall outline? And like
Mm-hmm.
knowing like sort of like what change need to be made, and like even if it's just small tweaks, small tweaks are the best kind, but like being able to give yourself permission to be like, this outline is just a guideline, and this is not the first outline, this is not going to be the last outline.
Yeah.
The outline is a living document until the final page is uploaded.
Yeah, 100%. And it's just about finding what works. And again, don't get caught in constantly changing like the finished work, and you don't have to get caught in it being quote unquote finalized either, but I would definitely give yourself that time before you start going into something that heavy with edits for that specifically. But definitely echoing what Rennie had said about cut content being used for extras. In our current chapter that we're finalizing now, it's our last longest chapter for the series, which I'm very excited for. And we actually had to cut a bunch of stuff out of it because it was just way too long. It's still at 91 pages now, and I didn't want to. I didn't calling myself out. I didn't want to hit 120 pages like I did in chapter 7. Not that it wasn't good, but I just don't want to go down that route again. So there were a lot of character moments that we actually kind of cut out. But we will be re-releasing into short mini comics, probably to Patreon first, and then maybe a year down the line, free for everybody. Who knows? Who knows how funky we'll get? But it's content that we've put into a document or kept in our sketchbooks and stuff like that, and we're like, okay, this will be safe for later. Didn't make it into the massive project, but it's still there.
Yeah, I really love that approach. The few times that I have used Google Documents, I'll if I have a little paragraph that, well, we just went a completely different direction now, I'll take it, I'll highlight it, I'll make it like a gray text instead of a black text, so I know like this was cut, this is not something that I need to concentrate on anymore, and that helps me visually, just like when I'm parsing down the page, like, okay, I know it's there. If I need it for a future reward or a future scene, it's there, but I don't need to focus on it anymore. I think that's important. And the other thing I really liked was waiting 2 years at least before you go into make writing changes, because I don't tend to cut a lot until after I'm done with pages, and it like I just need to see it all laid out. I need to see where the story actually went before I can really say like, okay, this served the future direction, this did not. And we've got the editing episode where we talk all about that. But for the purposes of outlining and trying to cut scenes before I draw them, one symptom in the outlining stage that I need to cut a thing is if I'm really, really struggling to make it logical. Like, I want this thing to happen, but the characters as I know them in this situation would never do this. And I always think of like shows where I'm watching and I'm yelling at the character to say, why don't they just tell somebody that they can see the 600 goats on bicycles? And I'm just like, come on. like this would be so much easier if you acted like a normal human being, but now you're just making up reasons why you can't tell the people to do this thing. And so that's a symptom of, well, why does this have to happen at all? If this doesn't make sense for a person to do, then maybe it shouldn't be happening, and maybe they should go in a different direction. What would be logical for a person in this situation to be doing? So that's where a lot of my planning stages kind of start diverging in different directions. And a lot of times it's about cutting things, but a lot of times I add stuff too. I like to show things to a small circle of beta readers, and if I'm explaining things and my beta readers are asking questions, they're not exactly understanding how I got from point A to point B, that's an indication that, okay, I've compressed this too much. I need to decompress. I need to add a few more points so that you understand what's happening. And sometimes that's just a couple more panels to show what happened between. Sometimes it's another scene, but just making sure again that whatever the characters are doing, it makes sense for a human to do. For me, I try to make scenes like like one scene is approximately 8 pages or one scene a month, because I feel that's a really good pace for the format of webcomics. So if I start going over that, I start thinking about what I can cut, what I can combine. I love thinking about characters. I love thinking about character moments, and sometimes I get a little too carried away with showing, okay, well, I have this funny joke that I really want to pull off. And a lot of times I can pull the joke off if I think about what else I can combine it with. If people can be walking and talking at the same time, just then I can keep the plot moving, but also get my little cute scene in there. But sometimes I have to cut a joke, and too bad, so sad. I'll make it into a meme later. um, but yeah, I think adding scenes, cutting scenes, again, it doesn't have to happen in the outline stage. You can clean that up like anytime before print. But if you find yourself doing a lot, or if you're finding yourself like wanting to do every single thing, that might be an indication that you're in reboot hell, and get out of reboot hell. Don't do that.
It is interesting because Crispy was mentioning earlier, like, spend at least like a couple years in the story before you start going back and like editing and cutting things. And I absolutely just started immediately, like cutting and moving stuff around. When it comes to figuring out how to make like changes in the moment, I mentioned earlier that I have an outline of kind of the whole story, but that outline is like extremely loose. And like the longer I go working on things, the farther away my story gets from that. And I'm usually only really thinking about kind of the next 1 or 2 chapters when I'm sitting down to like actually work on the outline. And part of why I'm only really paying attention to the moment that I'm in is that something that happens when I spend too long writing the outline and not drawing the story is that I'll be approaching things from a very plot-centric, top-down, like the overhead view from 1,000 kilometers away kind of mindset. And as soon as I actually get closer to it, that's when I start figuring out, like, wait a minute, it's not really in character for like this person to behave this way. Like I wrote in a note in the plot that like in my outline, like, oh, and then this person says this thing which causes this other person to do this other thing, and then I'll actually get there and be like, it's not in character anymore. I don't know why I thought it was. And I have to kind of step back, and or rather step closer actually, and put myself into the story itself to kind of see things from their perspective, and figuring out a way to get the plot to happen in the way that I want while keeping the character arcs intact. And I have actually, it's funny, I've cut scenes after I had drawn them out in full, sometimes after I'd colored them in full. A lot of the times my edits, especially if they're to existing pages, if if I thought of something and I had a very clear idea of how I could make this section better and strengthen kind of the character bonds. As we are recording this episode, chapter 10 of Witchwood has just started going up, and I added a scene to it 2 weeks ago, which is kind of a flashback that goes into like some of the characters' backstories. That was not in my outline at all. I thought that it was going to take me even longer to get into like flashback territory. But I realized that I had kind of an opportunity, thanks to the plot events that are happening in the chapter that just started, to kind of show a little bit, like, it felt like a good place for a dream sequence. And I'm not sure why it took me so long to see that. But kind of as soon as I have a clear picture of something that can make things better or more interesting or show a different perspective on something that might be of note to the readers, that's usually when I'll start kind of moving forward on implementing it. And like Delphina, also, I have a small circle of friends that I talk about my story to, like beta readers. I have a couple of friends who do know the entire outline of the story all the way to the very end. And sometimes, depending on how far out the plot point is that I'm thinking about changing, often my, not necessarily my first step, because the first step is to write down what I'm thinking about so that it's coherent. And then the second step, once I think it'll make sense to somebody who's not me, is that then I'll send it along and be like, what do you think about like this change? Like, does it work? Does it stay true to the themes of the story? I like to think that I'm constantly trying to compress things more so that stuff doesn't just kind of keep going forever, because I have a tendency to make things get longer as I work on them. So I'm constantly trying to think of ways to combine scenes together. You know, if I have a 12-page scene or something like that, it's like, can I just like shave off a few extra panels or combine motions? Like if they have to do something and say something, they'll do the thing and say the thing at the same time. And yet somehow things keep getting longer because I keep adding scenes. I don't know what's going on. But you know, it's a webcomic. I don't have a page count limit to obey, so I'll do whatever I feel will make the story better.
Well, I was just also thinking about, there's a lot of editing comes down to like whether you're following like animation beats versus comic beats. Like there's a lot you can learn by looking at different like Cape comics and stuff like that, where they really, really have to keep things in like 24 pages because that's what they need to do. So if you're feeling like you're a little too decompressed, that's what I would look for. But like animation almost has the opposite problem a lot of times, where an animator has this visual that's only going to take a couple seconds to show someone picking up a glass or somebody opening a door or something like that. But you don't need that in the comic form a lot of times, and a lot of times that's changing your pacing in a way that it doesn't actually need to be. You can imply a lot more.
We really got to have a whole episode about compression and decompression in comics, because it's such a big subject.
It is.
So that sort of kind of goes into some of the kind of like pitfalls and challenges involved with outlining. And, you know, what would you say are some of the biggest kind of hurdles to go through when doing this process?
I mean, for me, like the big thing is like the too long didn't read effect. Like if I start planning things and I'm overwhelming myself, that means that's not a good tool for me. Especially if my outline just goes way too deep into like pages and pages and pages, and I know I'm not going to read it. That's not a good tool for me. So that's, you always just have to kind of think about that. What is working with the way your brain works? And also just like kind of the psychological thing where I could try to plan a thing that's going to happen, but until I know exactly what and how the things before it happen, it might massively change what happens next. And like all of a sudden, everything that comes after it just kind of crumples down like a house of cards. And it really makes like the detailed outline seem like it was a waste of my time. So again, just trying to feed some fun into there, feed some play into there, and make the outline process enjoyable instead of a necessity, I think is really critical for me. And another psychological aspect is sometimes my first ideas are really bad. A lot of times my first ideas are really bad. And sometimes I feel like Rennie was saying, like the fancy notebooks are my worst enemy because I wrote them down. I wrote this idea down in a very nice notebook. I feel like it's set in stone now and I can't ever visit or change anything that happened there. And yeah, that's totally not true. So I really have to tell myself that it's not a permanent to-do list. It doesn't have to stay in that order. I can take the scissors to it, like Crispy was saying. I could do whatever I want that serves the way that I work. And at the end of the day, the outline stage, however you do it, is a loose structure. It's the thing that gets you going. It's the thing that gets your blank page filled with some sort of idea, so you have some sort of roadmap, but it's not the be all end all, and you can work however you need to.
Yeah, I don't think there really is any such thing as like a correct way to outline, because it's just going to come down to what's in the story. One pitfall that I used to run into a lot more when I was keeping track of everything on physical media was that I would just lose my documents all the time because I kept making these different versions of things. And sometimes I'd write down a cool scene in one notebook and then I couldn't find it when I actually got there. And I was like, I had this incredible idea and I can't remember it. And I know I wrote it down, but I don't know where I wrote it
The
down. So I would spend,
curse.
I'd go through all my old sketchbooks being like, where did I put it? Where did I put it? And honestly, there actually was a plot beat that I wrote down in Geralt that, like, it's forever lost to me. I'll never remember what it was. I had a cool idea and nobody will ever know what it is, including me, because that's just gone. I had to think of a new way around it.
We'll have to go to the cool idea graveyard.
Yeah, well, it's not even the graveyard because, well, okay, I guess it is because I'll never dig it up. But yeah, I now that I'm working in Google Documents, it's a little easier to keep track of things because I have my main outline that I kind of keep track of what is mostly current. Like it'll go out of date and then I'll update it. But I never fully delete anything these days. I have like an archive outline document where I kind of dump everything that I cut. So if I think of like if I wrote something and then I decided to remove it and then I'm like, oh, maybe I want to put that back in, I can go into the archive and I can do a little like control find thing and then I can copy paste it back in if I really really want to. Another thing that can be frustrating with the outlining process, it's just that sometimes like I like to keep things loose because I'm going to change things, up further in the future. But sometimes when I'm writing down what it is that I mean to be writing, I'll be like very, very vague with it. And that'll annoy me later on because my outlines will just be full of like, character says something cool that convinces the other person of the thing. And like saying they say a cool thing is not the cool thing. So if I have like a cool daydream or an idea or something, these days I'm trying to be as specific as possible with writing down the details of it. Because even if those change, it's kind of nice to see a version of the thing itself, even if it's not like super polished and it's not what actually ends up in the final thing, rather than kind of sitting there being like, what was it? Because sometimes I'll get to that cool thing beat and I'll think of something right away. And then other times I'll get there and I'll realize like I don't even know if this is working. Like maybe there's nothing they can say that convinces the other character, or the other character is in a receptive headspace right now, or they wouldn't feel like saying anything convincing at that moment. Sometimes that means I just have to scrap the beat and figure out something else entirely, like an external factor that gives things a push. And that part of the process can be a lot of fun, like just figuring out these different things. I got to keep myself on my toes. But I do like having like a little library of like neat moments that I can turn into doodles later on.
Yeah, I think that's a really important to be organized. Like if you're gonna have like some kind of outline at all, it's very important to figure out what kind of organization strategy works best for you. Because like I think one of the biggest hurdles that I've seen personally for outlining is that like if you don't have a structure that works for you, like Delphi said, you got to find a system that works for the way your brain thinks. If you don't have that, it's just going to be this wall of text. It's going to be or this wall of 80,000 files on Google Docs and you're not going to know how to do it. Like I know people who work great in Excel spreadsheets for their outlines. If I look at a spreadsheet, my eyes roll into the back of my head. So it's like, okay, that's not going to work for me. And if I force myself into working in something that doesn't work for me, the story's going to suffer. So you have to it's it's a very important part of the writing process to sort of be introspective on sort of like what things does your brain grab onto, what things does captures that imagination or lets you daydream, because I think that's like the biggest part of outlining is the daydreaming part, is the thinking about all the cool what ifs or the cool paths that you could take, and allowing yourself the space to explore those and move forward, sort of playing around it's in the sandbox, if you would. If you're too restrictive in your outlining process, it's going to be a harder time for you later. So yeah.
Break out the bingo cards.
Yeah, like the bingo cards was such a cool idea of just like especially like if it's a scene or a chapter that you're having a hard time with, like, gee, there's so many cool things I could do here, just plop them all there, throw a dartboard up and see, okay, let's see, what do we do, how, like, it's there's an old D&D trick of when you don't know what's going on in a story, or how to, there's too many different ways that you can move the plot forward, is the random encounter table. And it's a very similar thing to that bingo card, where it's like it's a way that you can sort of explore different things. Like, I view outlining as a thought experiment. It's not like anything hard or fast. It's a way for you to sort of play around and see the paths that you could take, because there will always be a cooler path that you can take. And it's, allowing yourself the space to sort of meander down that route.
I've seen one other writing exercise, which is that when you're stuck, just start writing out a list of all the things that could not possibly happen next. And you might actually find something pretty solid in that little rundown. Because as soon as you start kind of writing those things down, you're looking at something that's not a blank page anymore. Now you actually have ideas down there. And maybe something that you thought initially is like, well, that couldn't possibly happen next. As soon as it's sitting there on the page, like typed out or sketched out or whatever, looking back at you, you're like, but what if? Unless.
Yeah. The biggest enemy to every artist and writer is the blank page. So make it not blank. Even if it's just a scribble or a dumb idea of, the gang goes to a bar and they fall over, or the gang falls in a river, chaos ensues. Like, just make it not an empty page.
I try to write down even like the dumbest ideas that I think of. I'm like, oh, what a silly, goofy thing. Like if I smiled when I thought about it happening, like I'm just gonna write that down. Maybe it'll come in handy later.
Horse.
Maybe.
That's dangerous for me because I take that as a challenge. I'm like, oh, you think I can't make that happen? Okay, all right, we'll see how this goes.
You think better than me?
Yeah. That's why Somnambulist is the way it is.
It's so fun though. I love it.
I think when I have any kind of like personal kind of pitfalls or challenges, one of the things that is most tough for me, and I face this with art all the time, I have a problem, is that I want to do all the things. All the things, all the time, all at once. So, I want to get inspiration from people's pieces, but I also want to put like 8,000 versions of this inspiration into one piece. And, that's something that actually gets me kind of stuck in a lot of processes because I don't actually understand where I'm going anymore because I want to do all the different things. And sometimes that can happen with outlining when you are actually exposed to some people's processes and some people's ways of doing things. You can actually get hit by quite a large wall of being like, there's so many options, where do I even start? And like we've said in this episode, it's that I feel like it's a process itself to even learn how to do the outlining and how to understand how your brain works in this form to put these ideas in a tangible sense, whether it be on a document or be in a sketchbook or notebook or whatever. It's still something that you're taking from your brain and you're putting it on a page and you're trying to make sense so that it becomes something else. And then spiderweb ensues. It's gonna, go from here to here to here to here. And so one of the things that I think is best to keep in mind is how to understand when you're feeling overwhelmed and when to step back or understand the process or the parts that do make you feel overwhelmed. And again, definitely going to plug that bingo card because I think it's the cutest idea ever, is that Delphi found something that worked for her in something that, I personally didn't even think of. Didn't think that a bingo card would help, but thinking about it now, I'm just like, yeah, it totally makes sense. It has, this this tangible kind of like all these little points are up here and they're not very long, and then you can kind of just see where you go from there. And if that's something that works for you, I would embrace that. And that's the whole point, is to find something that works for you, and that each of our processes on this episode are very different from each other and the same in some other ways. So I absolutely encourage people to be very curious about how people go about their stories and comics and stuff like that, because I know now in the comic that we're going to be releasing soon is that I've changed my process from how we do Ghost Junk Sickness. I've completely rehauled the absolute chaos that we used to have over 8 years ago when we started this project. And, you know, it's much more cohesive now. And this is just stuff that I've learned from listening to my peers talk about the scripts that they do, the process of their outline, and etc., etc. All right. And I think with that, it is a chicken salad Caesar wrap. I have been Crispy, and you can find my work at ghostjunksickness.com.
And I've been Delphina. You can find my webcomic Sombulus at sombulus.com.
And I've been Rennie. You can find my work at katesblast.com.
And I've been Verathane, and you can find my work at chiralt.sevensmith.net or witchwoodcomic.com.
Heck yes. Heck
Now, I really want to hear more about that horse riding competition. That
Oh, the
we've been talking
ghosts?
about.
Like, here they have bicycles.
Yeah, the ghosts.
Like
the
6
ghosts
of
on
them?
bicycles.
Thanks for listening to Screen Tones. Subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts to be notified of new episodes. And be sure to follow us on Twitter at ScreenTonesCast.